The C.S. Lewis Institute presents an interview with Dr. Art Lindsley, based on his book, C.S. Lewis's Case for Christ, with Leesa Donner.
Myth and rationalism. We take up two very different topics in one program today. To be honest with you, Art, I really don't get the whole thing about myths. How do myths and Christianity intersect? And what was C.S. Lewis's essential problem here?
I think many people today struggle with the idea of the parallels between pagan myths and Christianity. And I know Lewis did when he was growing up, going through his school education. They would read a lot of the ancient myths, and he saw that there were some points of similarity between those and Christianity, and that provided a stumbling block. Nobody ever showed him how there was a connection between these ancient myths and Christianity that set apart Christianity as different, and he really came to the idea that Christianity was the myth become fact.
So Christ is the myth become fact. What do you mean by that?
The idea is that it's not surprising that there are a certain number of stories in the world. In fact, this whole progression to understanding that idea was instrumental in Lewis's conversion. He had a dinner one night with Tolkien, and this was a couple of years after he came to believe in God and before he had come to believe in Christ. And the discussion started like this, that Lewis said, myths are lies. And Tolkien said, no, they're not. And that precipitated an all-night conversation that started at dinner and then moved as they ended up walking around the grounds of Magdalen College, the beautiful trails that are there, and there was a windy night, very magical, where the leaves were blowing. And the way that Lewis argued it is that it's not surprising that there are certain fundamental stories. Now, Tolkien didn't argue this, but I would say I've heard that there are only 8 basic storylines. And all other stories are variations of these 8 basic stories. And Lewis argued it's not surprising that there be similar stories out there in the world. God has made the human mind and God has made reality. The only question is, are there any of these stories that are more true than all the others? Or to put it more precisely, are any of these stories the idea where the myth has become fact, where it's rooted in history? And Lewis argued that faith in Christ is that story, or else it's false.
So how did he, tell us a little bit about his conversion.
Well, after that all-night conversation, there were other times that, another period that happened, but it was largely, he points back to that conversation as really eliminating a major obstacle. His conversion to Christ wasn't very spectacular, though. He was riding with his brother Warren in the sidecar of a motorcycle on the way to the Whipsnade Zoo. And he said, when I left for the Whipsnade Zoo, I didn't believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, but when I got to the zoo, I did. Yet nothing particular had happened. He said it was as if you wake up in the morning, it's the first moment you realize you're awake. That's the way it was for Lewis. He just realized he was awake now to the idea that Jesus Christ was the Son of God.
I was on a trip to Greece not too long ago, and one afternoon I sat with a gentleman, and he told us his conversion story, and it was very much the same. He came home from work, he sat down on his sofa, he flipped the top off a soda can, sat down. Nobody had given him a tract, nobody had given him a Bible, he hadn't listened to Christian radio, anything like that. And a half an hour later, he stood up and he came to believe that Jesus Christ is Lord. And it was a real powerful conversion. It wasn't, just something for the day. So that's how he came to Christ.
Well,
so it does happen.
The interesting thing is, in that case, and then also with Lewis, it wasn't emotionalism that led to it. There was something beyond that had happened.
This whole thing touches on an area that you really didn't directly address in your book, but I believe is a major stumbling block to faith, and that is the authenticity of the Bible. How does this discussion of myths affect one's view of the Bible regarding biblical criticism?
Well, I discussed it somewhat, but there's a story where Lewis was meeting with a bishop once, and The bishop had to go out to answer some questions from someone, and he picked up a book next to him that was one of those that wanted to demythologize some of the stories of the New Testament. And he was reading it for a little bit, and the bishop came back in the room, and he asked Lewis what he thought of the book, and Lewis told him, and ended up actually giving a talk later to a bunch of seminarians that critiqued the demythologizing of his day. And he said basically that often New Testament critics were perhaps good at New Testament, but they weren't so good at understanding the nature of mythology or understanding how to sort out the difference between myth and history. And even very early, as a specialist in myth, from his early life and his time in the coal biters and from reading ancient literature and teaching on it and through the Middle Ages, he said his sense was, his taste was, that the New Testament was not myth. And he ended up producing some arguments in a talk that I referred to in that chapter that shows how the New Testament was not mythological.
Now let's move on to the area of rationalism. You write, quote, R minus F equals M, F minus R equals lowercase f. Okay, and so on and so forth. So tell us a little bit about this alphabet soup and why you think it really matters to study rationalism.
Well, Lewis was for a period of time captive to rationalism, and it's the Enlightenment philosophy, or the philosophy that, say, the new atheists hold today, this idea that reason or science is the only way to approach things. And he studied for a while under one that was a rationalist. His nickname was Kirk. And he was a great tutor that always interrogated him to be very precise in all of his thinking. In fact, when he arrived for the first time, never having met Kirk, he was trying to think of something to say to break the ice in terms of conversation. He mentioned the wildness of the scenery of Surrey, where he had just arrived by train, and Kirk said, "What? What do you mean wildness? And what grounds had you for expecting that it would be wild? And what do you mean by that word?" And after a series of interrogation, Kirk came to the conclusion that you had no understanding and there was no meaning. It was utterly meaningless what you said. Lewis was, of course, very taken back by that initial encounter, but he actually came to love the precise interrogation that Kirk had given him. In fact, even though Kirk died later, and before he'd written a lot of his works, people have said that he wrote his works with Kirk looking over his shoulder. And a lot of the clarity and precision of his thought and rhetorically ordering and making evidence for things that he said came out of that discipline that he got before he went to Oxford in studying with Kirk. But this rationalism was something that he later rejected, although he certainly was helped by Kirk, this atheist rationalist. And then later he ended up seeing the importance of revelation.
So what it all comes down to for Lewis is a classical approach to Christianity, faith plus reason. Now, that means we don't have to check our minds at the door.
Right. He said that if you think that the probable evidence points more elsewhere, then of course choose that direction. But he felt that if you looked at the nature of the evidence, there was more probable evidence leading towards Christianity than towards any other worldview or perspective. Or to put it another way, he said that there was enough probable evidence to lead to a psychological exclusion of doubt, though not a logical exclusion of dispute.
Wait, stop. Say that slowly and repeat it for me.
There was enough probable evidence to lead to a psychological exclusion of doubt, so that you could be certain that the evidence was in with respect to Christianity, but not a logical exclusion of dispute. There are obviously certain questions that you can't prove, or certain issues you can't resolve fully because they're mysteries about things, or questions that you don't have answers to. But there's enough, the evidence is enough in that you could argue that it's certainly according to preponderance of evidence, but perhaps even beyond a reasonable doubt that it's true. But in any case, there's enough evidence to argue that it's psychologically true. You can affirm it and rest in it.
That's why he was capable of making a case for Christ, because he looked at it both from both ends.
Yes, exactly.
In the section dealing with doubt, you say, quote, "If Christianity cannot face the toughest questions people today are asking, it will be the first time in history." I just love that. So let's talk a little bit about some of the brilliant minds who have embraced Jesus as their Lord.
Of course, there's a long list, but I'd start first with Jesus, who obviously was a genius in the way he put things forward. People are still fascinated. People that are atheists, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, are still fascinated with Jesus' genius and the principles that he teaches. Then the Apostle Paul. Some people have said that Paul is on the level of a Plato in terms of his brilliance and his genius. Then later throughout church history, we have certain people that rise to the top of the most brilliant people that have ever lived, people like Augustine, or perhaps later Aquinas, or others perhaps lesser known, Leibniz, or Luther, or Calvin, or Jonathan Edwards, and of course Lewis himself.
What about the area of science?
In the area of science, some of the greatest scientists were believers and believed that the evidence of science was not only pointed towards Christ, but really the whole endeavor of science was encouraged by faith in Christ, that reality is there, it's good, and it's actually real, and it could be studied, and it's good and it should be studied. And every particular truth, say of science, leads you back to the God of truth. That led early scientists and many today to be fearless in the discoveries of science.
You know, Art, some Christians today are terrified of their moments of doubt and often bury them and don't deal with them. And I know that I've been guilty of that as well. But you look at the psalmists, you look at different sections of the Bible, and you see that what God really wants is for us to come to Him with all of our doubts, with all of our fears. And so how did Lewis handle those issues?
Yeah, I'd say the worst thing to do with doubt is to say, just believe, don't doubt. It's important with younger people to get them to face their doubts and give them substantial answers to the questions that they're asking. For instance, Bertrand Russell asked a question to people when he's at age 16 as part of a church, and they didn't provide an answer. They said, don't doubt, just believe, and he ended up becoming an atheist. Well, Lewis faced his doubts. And I think it's important to do that. Any honest question deserves an honest answer. And if you don't have it, or send them to someone who does, can provide an answer to that. It's also important to understand that many of the kinds of doubts that we have are not just intellectual doubt. In fact, Os Guinness has a book on doubt where he says only one kind of doubt out of 7 is intellectual doubt. There are many other forms of doubt, like doubt from emotions, and Lewis discusses that kind of doubt, and I have a quotation in the book from that. Or there are doubts of a spiritual origin. There are doubts from a fear of commitment, and many other forms of doubt. I think it's important in our own lives, and also as we speak to others about doubt, to also discern whether the questions or the doubts people have are really from the intellect and can be satisfied through intellectual answers, or whether they can perhaps be addressed by discerning and dealing with the emotional factors that are present, or spiritual or otherwise. So it's important to discern the kind of doubt you're dealing with. And Lewis talks about some of these different kinds of doubts and how we end up facing them in his writings. And I give some place to that in the chapters that we're discussing.
Myth and rationalism. It's been a fascinating few minutes. Thank you.